Chloe woke up with a pounding headache. Struggling to open her eyes, she couldn't understand where she was, nor could she remember how she ended up there. It was dark around her, and she could hear some noises nearby. The shouting pierced through her head like a hammer. With difficulty, she got up from the bench and decided to investigate. Rounding the corner, she saw two young men trying to take a handbag from an elderly woman. "Hey, what are you doing?" she shouted as loudly as she could. "Whoa, bro, look, a young one showed up too," said one of the guys as he turned towards Chloe. The second guy decided to follow. The old woman, seizing the moment, began calling the police. "Hello, please come quickly to 25 Lenina Lane. They tried to rob me, and now they're going after a girl," she said. "A unit is already on the way." The operator responded. Someone else from the building already called. The old woman hung up and decided to approach. She needed to buy some time. "What? My handbag doesn't interest you anymore?" she asked. "Get lost, Granny. Can't you see we've got a fine lady here?" one of them replied. Without thinking of anything better to do, she picked up a stone from the ground and threw it at the guys. They stepped away from the girl and started moving towards her. Just then, the police car arrived. The officers took the young men away, gathered the elderly woman's information, and left. "What's your name, my savior?" the old woman asked as she came closer. "Chloe. And I'm Mrs. Clark. Chloe, you don't look so well. Come with me, I'll make you some tea. I live right here," she said, pointing to a nearby house. "I'm no savior. Someone else called the police," Chloe said. "Yes, dear, but you weren't afraid to step in. It could have ended badly for you. Come on, let's go." They entered the building and climbed to the second floor. Chloe thought the light in the apartment was too bright, and she squinted, stopping at the doorway. "Don't be afraid, come in," Mrs. Clark said, clapping her hands when she finally got a good look at her rescuer. "Quick, take off your shoes and come to the bathroom. You need to clean that wound." "Oh, dear. Who did this to you?" Chloe followed her into the bathroom, and Mrs. Clark started washing the wound on her head. "Tom, bring me my kit from the bedroom," she called out into the apartment. A few minutes later, a boy about 7 years old appeared at the doorway. "Don't just stand there like a statue. This is Chloe. She saved me from those robbers. Come help. I taught you everything, didn't I?" 20 minutes later, they were all sitting in the kitchen, drinking tea. "Mrs. Clark, I don't remember anything. I only remember my name clearly, and nothing else. I don't even know how I got here." "Well, you got hit on the head hard enough to forget everything. Maybe you have some documents in your pockets?" Mrs. Clark suggested. "I haven't even checked." Tom, quick to catch on, brought her jacket from the hallway and handed it to Chloe. Checking the pockets, Chloe pulled out only a photograph. It was of her hugging a young man. She turned the photo over and saw the inscription. "Never give up, sis. James?" "I have a brother," she said. "That's good news. That means someone's looking for you. You'll stay with us tonight, and tomorrow we'll figure out what to do." Chloe couldn't sleep. She desperately wanted to remember who she was and where she came from, but nothing came to her mind. The more she tried, the more her head hurt. Soon the pain and exhaustion took over, and she fell asleep. When she woke up, the clock on the wall showed noon. "Good morning, Sleeping Beauty." "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't think I'd sleep that long." "Don't apologize. We're in no rush. I've already called around. No missing person reports that match your description, but the police are still checking. I gave them all your details. We also need to get you to a doctor, and I've arranged that too," Mrs. Clark said. "But I don't have any documents." "That's not a problem. A lot of people in this town owe me a few favors," Mrs. Clark smiled. "You know how many lives my grandmother saved? She was a surgeon," Tom said proudly. "Hush! You don't brag about saving lives. It's a doctor's duty. I've just made a few connections over the years. Now I'm retired, looking after this one while his father's working away," Mrs. Clark explained. Chloe didn't ask where Tom's mother was. It wasn't her place. After a hearty meal, they headed to the hospital. She was taken to various rooms for examinations and tests. The final diagnosis, amnesia due to head trauma. Her memory would return in time, but for now, she needed further treatment. "You'll stay with us for now," Mrs. Clark said over dinner. "I'll take good care of you, better than a hospital could." "Thank you, Mrs. Clark. You know, while we were at the hospital, I somehow recognized the names of medical equipment. It may not mean much, but maybe I worked in a hospital. Time will tell. Don't stress too much about trying to remember. You need to rest that head of yours," Mrs. Clark advised. When Tom saw the cake on the table in the evening, he lit up with excitement. "Are we celebrating something today?" "Yes," Chloe smiled. "I got a job. Actually, it's your grandmother who helped me with it." "And now you're leaving us?" the boy asked sadly. "She's not going anywhere. Who would let her go? She's like family now," Mrs. Clark reassured him with a smile. Their laughter was interrupted by a knock at the door. Chloe hurried to open it. People often came by to ask Mrs. Clark for help, whether it was to check their blood pressure or ask for advice. Despite telling people they should see a doctor for proper treatment, neighbors kept coming to her. They knew Mrs. Clark might grumble, but she would always help. This time, a man with a bag stood at the door. Chloe didn't recognize him at first, but Tom yelled out with joy, "Dad's here!" The boy quickly started telling his father all about their guest, while Chloe blushed as Tom made her out to be some sort of superhero in his story. Later, after putting Tom to bed, the adults gathered in the kitchen. "So that's the story, son. Now you know everything," Mrs. Clark said. "Why didn't you tell me over the phone?" "I looked so foolish when Chloe opened the door," the man, now introduced as Mr. Clark, said. "You're always too busy. And look, you didn't even tell us you were coming. How long are you home for this time?" Mrs. Clark teased. "Oh, am I already getting on your nerves?" Mr. Clark laughed. "Keep talking and you'll see what happens." Mrs. Clark pretended to swing a dish towel at him. They set up a fold-out bed for Mr. Clark in Tom's room. "Mrs. Clark, maybe I should sleep there?" Chloe asked shyly. "He's Tom's father and hasn't seen him in a while. Besides, we girls need our own space. No arguments," Mrs. Clark replied firmly, making it clear the conversation was over. Days passed quickly. At first, Chloe found it hard to adjust to work, but soon she began to appreciate the chance to talk to patients. She listened to their stories about life and illnesses, and often when they talked about their conditions, she felt like she somehow knew what treatments they needed. She brushed it off as overhearing the doctors talk about their cases. No one complained about her work, so even the usually stern Mr. Williams, her supervisor, stopped reminding her that she could lose her job at any time, even though Mrs. Clark had brought her in. There was just one thing that still bothered her. She couldn't remember who she was or what had happened to her. She often looked at the photograph, silently wondering why her brother wasn't looking for her. On weekends, they all often went out together as a group. Chloe felt like she had always lived with this family. Tom, especially, was always by her side. She worried that the boy was becoming too attached, knowing the time would come when she'd remember everything and leave. For him, it would be a loss. And to be honest, Chloe realized it would be a loss for her too. Work was particularly hectic today. From the morning, everyone was rushing around, doing something. Orders were flying in from all directions. Only later did Chloe learn that some important official was coming for an inspection, and everyone was trying to make sure everything was. Chloe wasn't too concerned about the visit. She always did her job well. She had just one more room to clean, and a new patient had been admitted there today. As she cleaned, several doctors came in, deep in discussion about the patient's diagnosis and symptoms. They argued and tried to convince each other, completely ignoring Chloe. The noise made her head spin, so she sat down for a moment. No one paid any attention to her as usual. When the dizziness passed, Chloe stood up and instinctively approached the patient. She checked his pupils, took his pulse, looked at the monitors and the test results nearby. The doctors stopped arguing, startled by her boldness. Turning to them, Chloe said, "You're all wrong. This patient needs to be transferred to the neurology department immediately, and additional tests should be done." She scribbled down something on a piece of paper and handed it to one of the doctors. On it, she wrote what she believed to be the correct diagnosis. Her supervisor, Mr. Williams, was the first to recover from the shock. "How dare you even touch the patient? You're just a cleaner. Get out and don't ever let me see you here again." Realizing what she had done, Chloe hurried out of the room, thinking it would be best to leave the hospital entirely. Mrs. Clark was surprised to see her home early. "What happened?" she asked. Chloe lowered her head and told her everything. "Wait a minute. There's some truth in what you said. I mean, about the diagnosis and the patient. Let me make a few calls. Which doctor did you give that note to? Mrs. Clark asked. She returned to the kitchen about 20 minutes later. Well, I've got some good news and some bad news. Which do you want first? Let's start with the bad news. Mr. Williams won't take you back, and the others will be too afraid to hire you now. And the good news? You were right. That doctor decided to check your suspicions and ran the additional tests. The patient's condition has already improved, and that means you're starting to remember something. Chloe smiled. These good news outweighed the bad. She'd find another job. Later that evening, Mr. Clark brought more good news. He'd found a job in the city and wouldn't be traveling anymore. He asked if he could stay at Mrs. Clark's house for now, since it would be hard for him to take care of Tom on his own. Of course, Mrs. Clark was delighted, and she hoped it wasn't just her and Tom keeping her son in the city. 3 days later, there was a knock at the door. When Mrs. Clark opened it, she immediately recognized the young man standing there. It was Chloe's brother. She invited him inside. The moment Chloe saw him, her head began to spin. She instantly recognized him, having stared at his photo so many times. He ran over and caught her before she could fall. "Sis, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." "Stop talking so much. Can't you see she's not well? Let her take her medicine, and then we'll talk," Mrs. Clark scolded him. Later in the kitchen, James explained, "I had to go abroad to finalize contracts for medical equipment. We inherited a clinic from our parents, where Chloe was the head doctor. We split the responsibilities. She handled the patients, and I took care of the paperwork. When I called the clinic, they told me Chloe had taken a leave of absence. When she didn't answer her phone, I assumed she wanted some time alone. She'd just broken off her engagement after catching her fiancé in bed with someone else. But when I returned, I found out that her assistant had made up the leave of absence because Chloe hadn't shown up to work. I was furious and started calling everyone I knew, asking about her. Just as I was about to go to the police, Mr. Evans called. He said he'd recently been in your town and thought he'd seen Chloe at the hospital, but she was dressed as a cleaner. That's when I came here. The chatty nurses told me about the cleaner who'd made the correct diagnosis for a critically ill patient. I showed them a picture, and they recognized her. Finding out the address was easy after that. I came here to clear my head and explore the city. I wanted to open a new clinic in another town and escape my bad memories. But while I was walking around, I got hit from behind," Chloe quietly murmured. 4 months passed. "Dad, is Chloe really coming today?" Tom asked. "Yes, son. Now, don't bother me. I'm preparing for her arrival." "Preparing? All you did was roast a chicken and put on a clean shirt," Mrs. Clark teased with a laugh. "Dad, is she staying for good this time?" Tom persisted. "If your dad is brave enough, she will," Mrs. Clark said with a wink. "Mom, stop it. I told you, I'm getting ready," Mr. Clark replied, flustered. That evening, they all gathered in the kitchen, just like before. Only this time, James was there too. Raising her glass, Chloe said, "I'm so grateful that life brought me to such wonderful people. We've decided to open a clinic here, and I'm staying." "Yay!" Tom shouted, and Chloe ruffled his hair. "I've missed you all, and I'm not going anywhere. I promise." "And you guys keep an eye on her for me," James said, winking at Mr. Clark. He, like Mrs. Clark, had long since figured out what was going on. That's how the story ends, friends. Join the conversation below and share your thoughts on this story. If you found it captivating, share the link with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story that will make your heart race. Your support inspires us to create more tales. Take care and see you next time.